couple of weeks ago, we were able to record an interview with author Vivian Morgan.
When Vivian Morgan was a reporter for television news back in the 1980s and 90s, she herself was familiar with using ruses to disguise the fact she was a journalist. In her case, her cover was occupational rather than physical. She would sometimes pose as a nurse or a bird watcher when pursuing stories in communist Eastern Europe. In more recent times, she stumbled across a 19th century book about women adventurers who dressed as men to make it easier for them to travel. Her curiosity aroused, she did her own wide research and found there'd been a host of women cross-dressing so they could join the military and go off to war. She's now written a book about it with the catchy title of Cross-Dressed to Kill, and here she is talking about it.
Who were these cross-dressers? They were aged between 14 and in their mid-20s, sharing a common drive to do something. They were patriotic, answering their monarch's call to defend their country. They stood at garden gates, watching soldiers march by, and their own men leaving to enlist, and wanted to be there too. We're talking about 300 years of constant war that these women lived through. The American Emma Edmonds, for one, said she didn't want to stay home and weep. And Louisa May Alcott, the writer, was determined to play her part. And so it turned out for hundreds of others. For some it was an 18th century gap year. Others lasted only a few weeks before dying on the battlefield or being discovered, but some stayed in disguise for years. I wanted to know if they were lesbian or transgender, and many described feeling masculine inside, but more as an excuse, it seemed, for their tomboy actions. But there were gay women and one transgender who was executed in Holland. Most were using cross-dressing as a way to leave home, to follow husbands or search for lovers, or just be part of mainstream life. They showed strength in what the American newspapers called pluck and spunk. A horrible phrase, but apt when you read about the hardships where they went through in the battlefields of Flanders, the West and East Indies, and under fire. They weren't afraid to kill and were often hit and killed themselves.
The transgender travel writer Jan Morris and the playwright Oscar Wilde both wrote that if you act the part of someone you're not, then it can rapidly cease to be acting and you begin to assume the new identity, in this case the persona of a man. Is that what happened in these women's cases?
They walked, talked and behaved like men, having lots of so-called affairs and flirting, to be one of the boys and even go brothel creeping with fellow sailors. Men's clothing was fairly shapeless and layered, with baggy shirts, waistcoats, and breeches that easily hid a female form. Army uniforms were ill-fitting for the regular soldiers. Hygiene was poor, and few soldiers washed, and usually slept in their shirts and underclothes. So again, room to keep their sex secret. Being clean-shaven and with rosy complexions, the young girls passed as boys and were nicknamed Mollies by their comrades, a teasing name used for gay men.
How did they cope with things like a call of nature, one wonders? You'd have thought there might have been many an opportunity for them to be found out.
Pipes and horns helped urinate while standing, but not much is given away in their published accounts about any personal problems like menstruating, because the printers were keener on details of battles fought that they often added to the stories the women told them, better for sales. The law was clear on cross-dressing throughout this time. It was illegal and punishable by death, banishment or whipping, depending on the country in question. The most famous cross-dresser is Joan of Arc, and we know that she was burned at the stake by a church angered by her assuming male disguise, which was anathema and punishable by death. The best documented trials of women come from Holland, where women were executed and punished for impersonating men, trying to marry while disguised as men, and having sex with women. For those fighting, some died on the battlefield or wounded, or were discovered as their jackets were ripped open in hospital tents. Army officers, especially in Eastern Europe, allowed women to remain, in uniform and fighting, because they recognized their bravery and skills. Angélique Brulon got the Legion of Honor. Many others received medals too, and the most decorated woman soldier still today is the Serbian Milunka Savic.
It was in 1912 that Milunka Savic volunteered to take the place of her brother when he received his call-up papers for the First Balkan War. She cut her hair and donned men's clothes and was soon in combat. Milunka's true gender was only discovered when she was wounded and needed medical attention. A commanding officer decided not to punish her because she had indeed been such a competent soldier, and she went on to win medals fighting in the First World War.
Women were found at the battles of Waterloo and Trafalgar and all the major European battles. When discovered, news spread of their real sex and helped make their name, the equivalent perhaps of reality stars today. Their stories were published, poems and popular songs written about their exploits. The British gossip magazines of the day, like Town and Country, loved these stories, for the theatres ran plays featuring women disguised as men throughout the 18th century, and famous actresses like Charlotte Chark or the French Madame Maupin or Dutch Michi de Bruin were openly gay off stage. These women were given audiences with their curious king or queen and awarded pensions. Hannah Snell, for one, performed at music halls, marching and singing in her uniform. But fame was short-lived, and none of the women made much money, returning to wear petticoats as ordered, but I like the fact that some of them kept their trousers and boots on too.
So what about today? Are there any memorials to these women in Britain or elsewhere in the world?
Recently, Hannah Snell's family home in Worcester had a plaque put on it commemorating her. Statues and carved gravestones abound across Europe, and the American Deborah Sampson is now used by the US Army for recruiting campaigns, having been kicked out in disgrace for being a woman centuries ago. All these women I see as early feminists who crashed through the barriers of gender and role stereotyping. They show that you can achieve anything if you really want to. For them, patriotism had no sex, nor did the right to a full life. And I believe their names should be included in history books, not just military ones, but in general and women's histories, as role models for girls. Historically, it wasn't until the Crimean and the American Civil War that women could be in conflict zones, as nurses, led by Florence Nightingale, and hundreds flocked to enroll. Today, women are still wanting equal rights, access to careers at all levels, whether in the army or elsewhere. They have their hopes and dreams.
These days, of course, women take part in combat in many parts of the world. They pilot fighter planes, launch missiles from submarines, or fight as Kurdish guerrillas in Iraq with no need to hide their gender. Times have certainly changed.
Vivian's book, Cross-Dressed to Kill, not to be confused with the fictional work of the same name by Andrew Lucas, is available in paperback or as an e-book.